September, Paul was at the World's Fair in San Francisco, getting ready for the big convention of women voters. The fair, which overlooked San Francisco Bay, was a fairyland of pools and lagoons, exhibit palaces, and soaring arches. A 400-foot tower of jewels shimmered at the night under the beams of giant searchlights. Throngs of people visited the fair every day. The Congressional Union's booth, decorated in purple, white, and gold, was at the entrance of the Palace of Education. So many people were visiting the booth, about 400 each day. With that in mind, Paul set out a giant petition in the form of a long scroll for them to sign demanding the Congress pass the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Then, in typical Alice Paul fashion, she came up with a dramatic way to deliver it to Congress. Paul asked 2 volunteers from California to take the petition on a cross-country drive to the Capitol, making speeches and gathering more signatures along the way. 2 Swedish suffragettes who lived in New Jersey offered Paul the use of their overland car, which they had just bought and were going to drive home. Paul was delighted. Women driving without a man in the car would get plenty of attention, especially if they were crossing the entire United States with a giant petition. Sarah Bard Field was one of the Californians. She was divorced and shared the care of her 2 young children with her ex-husband. She did her best to say no to Paul. "Do you realize that automobiles have to be serviced?" she asked. "I hear that service stations across the country are very scarce and you have to have a great deal of mechanical knowledge in case the car has some accident." "Oh well," Paul replied, "if that happens, I'm sure a good man will come along that'll help you." Before Field ever had met her, Alice Paul's old friend Mabel Vernon had described to Field her magical powers of persuasion. "She was the most deep and beautiful violet blue eyes," Vernon said, and when they look at you and ask you to do something, you could no more refuse." It was true. Field did not refuse. At the 3-day National Convention of Women Voters, delegates voiced their support for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, as Paul hoped they would. On the last evening, September 16th, thousands gathered outside under the magical lights of the fair for the finale, inspirational songs sung by the female chorus that was almost as big as the audience. Around midnight, the fair gates swung open to reveal the new overland car with the 2 Swedish women sitting in the front. Sarah Bard Field and the second volunteer, Frances Jolie, hopped in the back, and off they drove into the night. Jolie didn't last long. By the time they reached Sacramento, about 90 miles away, she had enough. She mentioned health problems and told her companions she would rejoin them when they neared the East Coast. Interstate highways did not exist in 1915. Sarah Bard Field and the 2 Swedish women bumped and bounced across through roads, wondering whether they would make it to the next gas station before they ran out of fuel. In Kansas, after torrents of rain, the wheels of the overland sank into the mud in the middle of the night. The car refused to budge. Where was the good man who was going to come along and rescue them? Field trudged through the mud in her traveling suit until she found him, a farmer, who pulled out the car with his team of horses. Meanwhile, Mabel Vernon was doing the advance work, traveling ahead of the overland by train to make sure that Field and the great petition would be welcomed at the next stop. Newspapers followed their trip breathlessly. Over the Sierra and Rocky Mountains, across the great American deserts, through the Iowa prairies and Kansas mud holes, a suffrage car is speeding from San Francisco to Washington, reported the Daybook from Chicago on November 20th. The Overland rolled into Washington, D.C. on December 6th, with Frances Jolie in the back seat once more, escorted by thousand suffragettes waving purple, white, and gold pennants. Jolie and Field made their way to the Capitol. They marched up the steps and presented their petition, a scroll 100 feet long filled with 5,000 signatures, to a delegation of congressmen and senators. The 64th Congress was convening for its first session that day, and the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was at center stage. Under Alice Paul's direction, the Congressional Union's latest political theater production, though long, complicated, and exhausting, was a complete success. The Union held its first national convention the same week in the elegant new headquarters right across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House. The mood was upbeat at Cameron House, as the yellow brick mansion was called. The Union was also 4,500 members strong, and it now had 19 state chapters. Everyone was feeling optimistic about the passage of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. In fact, NAWSA's new president, Carrie Catt, the woman who had given Alice Paul a tongue lashing during a convention 2 years before, privately tossed a union banquet. The Congressional Union has purchased the federal amendment to the front, she said to a union member, no matter what anybody says about it. Catt could not bring herself to pay such a tribute to Alice Paul directly. She remained Paul's opponent, though she and Paul were similar in many ways. They both threw themselves heart and soul into the struggle for women's suffrage and expected their volunteers to be dedicated too. Both women excelled at organizing big campaigns. Although they were reserved, Paul and Catt inspired great admiration and affection among their followers. But Catt thought Paul's campaigns against the Democrats were bound to anger party members who actually supported women's suffrage. The two women had tried to reconcile their differences at a meeting in December between NAWSA and the Congressional Union leaders. But Catt had ended the meeting abruptly. All I wish to say is that I will fight you to the last ditch, she hissed, looking directly at Paul. Alice Paul realized that 1916 was a big election year. All the members of the House and a third of the Senate were up for re-election, and Woodrow Wilson was running for a second term. Paul was dreaming up grand schemes for this election, and because she and Lucy Burns were now renting bedrooms in Cameron House, she could much too easily, work around the clock. For this election, Paul planned once again to encourage women voters to use their political clout, which had grown since 1914. 11 states now granted women full voting rights. A 12th, Illinois, allowed women to vote for president, which brought the total number of women voters to about 4 million. Paul was determined to present these voters with a new weapon, their own political party. In the spring, the Congressional Union got word out to the women voters in suffrage states about an upcoming convention in Chicago just for them. No one had a more exciting time helping out with this task than Lucy Burns. While gripping a suffrage banner, Burns climbed into a hydroplane behind the pilot and flew over Seattle, Washington. The 80-mile-per-hour wind blew away her banner, but Burns managed to suffrage bomb the city with leaflets. About 1,400 women gathered on June 6th for their convention. Since the Republican Party was also in Chicago for its convention, the city was swarming with reporters, and some were at the Blackstone Theater to witness the birth of the first political party for women, the National Women's Party. Alice Paul, who was not from a suffrage state and could not vote, kept herself in the background. She let Western women make the speeches. In the evening, representatives of the Democratic and Republican parties made their appeals to the newly empowered women voters. The Daily Capital Journal from Oregon noted the suitors with tongue-in-cheek. Old party galleons are already paying serious court to the new women's suffrage party. She already demonstrated that she is not easily to be beguiled by the flattering phrases of those who love her for her votes alone, but will insist upon, in return, a national suffrage amendment. The Republican presidential candidate, Charles Evans Hughes, was won over. He announced his support for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. but the Women's Party did not endorse him in any way. Instead, it stuck with the Congressional Union's policy of opposing the party in power, the Democrats, for failing to pass the amendment. To Wilson's campaign slogan, "He kept us out of the war," the Women's Party replied with their own, which they displayed on his banners. "Vote against Wilson. He kept us out of suffrage." Paul sent her best organizers out west to rouse women voters against the Democrats. Some were now members of the National Women's Party, including Maud Younger from California. Others, such as Lucy Burns, represented the Congressional Union. Paul expected a lot for her volunteers because she drove herself mercilessly. She was sleeping every night during the election campaign. The volunteers were game. Despite their grueling schedules, much of them even managed to have fun. A country fair in Wyoming, Maud Younger entertained fairgoers with dramatic account of the women's shirtwaist makers' labor strike in New York City. Then she played a piano in a circus tent. Inez Milholland Boissevain, who had sat astride her white horse at the front of the suffrage parade in 1913, drew the biggest crowd. The combination of her stirring speeches and great beauty proved irresistible. So Paul gave Boissevain one of the most demanding schedules, 50 presentations in 30 days. When Boissevain, exhausted, tried to get out a speaking engagement, Paul urged her to keep going. Paul did not realize that her star speaker was suffering from a rare and life-threatening type of anemia. In October 23, after 19 days on the road, Boissevain fainted while giving a speech at a crowded hall in Los Angeles. She was hospitalized 3 days later and was still in the hospital on November 7th, Election Day. It was an election with a surprising ending. Most people who went went to bed before dawn to the East Coast thought Charles Evans Hughes was going to be the next president, but Wilson crept ahead in the wee hours and pulled out a victory. Many of the Democratic candidates for Congress prevailed too. The wild card was war raging in Europe. Western women voters did not want to see their husbands and sons leave for the battlefield across the Atlantic, and many of them voted for Wilson. He kept us out of war proved to be a more powerful slogan than he kept us out of suffrage. Paul didn't believe the Congressional Union and National Women's Party had truly lost. "As far as I can gather," she wrote, a Union member in Boston, Democratic leaders have come out of the campaign with a profound respect for the strength back of the national women's suffrage movement. By the end of the month, Paul and many of her colleagues around the country were grieving. Inez Milholland Boissevain died on November 25th at 30 years of age. She just was so beaming with her belief in what she was doing, so extremely sincere, Paul remembered. Years later, Paul told an interviewer that Boissevain had given her life for women's suffrage. Her last words, said Paul, were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Those words appeared on many suffragette banners during the fight for the ballot, and since Boissevain didn't live to enjoy that hoped for liberty, they were doubly powerful. Okay, next chapter. Alice Paul was not there when the National Women's Party interrupted President Wilson's annual December address to Congress in 1916. But decades later, the episode still made her laugh. "It was very effective," she said, "very effective. Only invited guests were allowed in the House chamber, and Paul was not a favorite of Wilson's administration, but a few members of the Congressional Union had managed to get personal invitations." Early in the morning on December 5th, Mabel Vernon folded up a large banner with the help of Mary Gertrude Findle, a younger and very dedicated volunteer. Then Findle pinned it to Vernon's dress with a giant belt pin so that it sat neatly on her stomach and hips. Finally, Vernon slipped into the brown coat belonging to a much larger woman and finishing touch to her bizarre outfit. The pair headed out to the Capitol building and hurried toward the great chamber of the House of Representatives. When they arrived at the door to the gallery where spectators sat, they discovered it was locked. It was only 7 in the morning after all. They would be first in line when the door opened, just as they had planned. A guard gave Vernon his seat, thinking that she was pregnant and not realizing that she was pregnant with a banner. Three comrades from the Congressional Union appeared. When the doors to the gallery opened, the 5 women slipped into the front row, facing the podium below where Woodrow Wilson would stand to deliver a speech. So far, so good. The chamber soon filled with conversational buzz of invited guests, congressmen, and senators. A burst of applause greeted President Wilson when he appeared in the chamber, and it continued as he made his way to the podium. When the room grew quiet and Wilson launched into his speech, Mabel Vernon opened her coat. She undid the giant belt pin and signaled to her Congressional Union comrades. Suddenly, a large yellow banner unfurled over the railing of the gallery facing Wilson. The banner demanded, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" Gasps were heard in the crowded galleries. The president smiled thinly and continued with his speech. Meanwhile, an assistant doorkeeper jumped up to get the banner. On his third try, he snatched it out of the hands of 5 women who had been holding it up with strings. It was all over. To Alice Paul's delight, the incident was reported to newspapers across the country from New York City to Tacoma, Washington, sometimes on the front page. The Congressional Union had known the president was not going to mention the passage of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment when he outlined his plans for the coming year. And they had made their point, but how would they persuade this president to use his influence with the Congress to get the amendment passed? They would they would go see him and try to reason with him one more time. On Tuesday, January 9th, 300 members of the Congressional Union walked out of their headquarters at Cameron House, crossed Pennsylvania Avenue, and filed into the White House. The president, who had agreed to see them, sat through several speeches looking annoyed. When it was his turn to say a few words, he did not ask why he should help them, despite the fact that they had tried to disrupt his address to Congress in December. Nor did he mention that they had campaigned against him during the fall election campaign. He remained dignified and presidential, though he may have been very angry with the Congressional Union. Wilson liked people who demonstrated their loyalty to him, and he kept his distance from those he felt had betrayed him. The president told the women that he was bound to support the official position of the Democratic Party. Each state must decide on its own whether or not to give women the right to vote. He concluded with a flourish. "I have done my best, and shall continue to do my best, in the interest of a cause in which I personally believe." The room fell silent. The president stood still as if waiting for applause, but none came, and he strode out of the room abruptly. As Wilson and his visitors knew well, Wilson was perfectly free to urge Democratic congressmen as well as Republicans to support the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Back at Cameron House, Alice Paul, the rest of the executive committee, and all the women who had been at the White House talked about what to do next. They had sent every kind of delegation they could think of to the president. Each time he said more or less the same thing. Then he forgot about women's suffrage until the Union found another way to remind him. We can't, we can't, women, do anything more in the line," said the 60-year-old Harriet Blatch. "We have got to take a new departure," she continued. "We have got to keep the question before him all the time." How to give the president a constant reminder. Blash proposed a new tactic. Picket the White House. They would be she said, silent sentinels of liberty, still smarting from their interview that day with the president. The women quickly raised $3,000 among themselves for raincoats, umbrellas, and the fines they might have to pay in court. We could wait no longer, remembered Doris Stevens. Volunteers signed up for centennial duty, and the fight was on. They planned to picket almost daily until President Wilson's second inauguration on March 5th, the day before. They would hold a large demonstration, the climax of their picketing campaign. Alice Paul was no doubt encouraged by everyone's enthusiasm. The executive committee had discussed the plan earlier in January, and she had already begun interviewing women she thought would make good pickets. Mary Findles had said yes, but Sarah Bard Field, one of her most dedicated volunteers, had refused. Alice Field said during the interview, picketing means jail, and jail means probably hunger strikes because we can't just stay in jail the rest of our lives, and we'll have to try their still more drastic processes. Yes, Paul agreed. That's likely. Field was not faint-hearted, and she proved that a year ago on her cross-country automobile trip to deliver the giant petition to Congress. But now she had arrested or inactive tuberculosis and thought hunger strikes would be dangerous for her. It would mean a very possible death, she said. Well, that would be very good for the cause, replied Paul. She was not joking. Was Alice Paul really so cruel and heartless? Field didn't think so. She spared nobody because she was willing to give everything herself, she said later. But this time Field said no, and she stuck with it. On Wednesday morning, the day of the Congressional Union's frustrating visit with President Wilson, Paul escorted 12 Sentinels on the short walk from the Cameron House to the White House gates. The purple, white, and gold tricolor banners that many of the women held up brightened the winter landscape and were echoed by the sashes they wore across their coats. It was a mild day in the 50s, perfect weather for picketing. It was also a nice day for playing golf, and as Alice Paul and her entourage walked around the White House, the president rode towards the links. Paul gave the orders the first day. Stand at either side of the two gates with your backs to the wall, she said. That way people could see the big yellow banners, which were so large they could read from a block away. Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? The banners were copies of the one that had shocked everyone at the president's December address. Curious passersby gathered around the pickets, and some of them tried to strike up conversation with them, but the women remained true, silent sentinels and did not say anything. Neither did President Wilson as his car whizzed by them. He did flash a smile, and maybe that was because he had played a good round. Alice Paul woke up Thursday morning to plenty of press coverage on the pickets, some of it positive and some of it, as she had expected, quite the opposite. The Washington Times described the pickets as pioneer sentinels. The New York Times grumbled, the White House has been picketed before, but never until today by hostile suffragists. Thursday's hostile suffragists battled against much colder weather than the previous day's pioneers. They made good use of one of the most unusual donations that the Congressional Union had received, a muskrat coat, which the women took turns wearing. On the cold days that followed, the pickets stood on hot bricks wrapped in burlap, which the janitor brought over in a wheelbarrow from the Union's headquarters. Sometimes they were invited to warm up in the White House at the invitation of the president, but the pickets politely refused the offer. Members of the Cosmos Club, many of them male scientists, helped out on cold days too. Though not intentionally, the club was next door to the Congressional Union's headquarters, and the pickets saw the men glaring out the club windows as they walked to the front of the White House. We enjoyed irritating them, Doris Stevens remembered, standing on the icy pavement on a damp wintry day, knowing that within a stone's throw of our agony there was a greater agony than ours. There was a joy in that. Soon the entire nation seemed to be talking about the pickets. Newspaper cartoons helped spread the word by lampooning them. One cartoon in St. Louis Post-Dispatch showed how readers could profit from the Congressional Union's tactics by picketing the boss up for a raise, the janitor to raise the heat in the apartment building, or a man in the crowded streetcar to give up his coveted seat. From the offices at Cameron House, Alice Paul dealt with the backlash. She probably wasn't too concerned about the opinion of the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, which declared that the Congressional Union was risking an assassination of the president. A picket could hide a weapon under her a picketed picket could hide her weapon under her coat. Paul may have been amused by the words that one congressman used to describe the pickets, iron-jawed angels. The stream of complaints that poured from Congressional Union members worried Paul more. Some of them even resigned. And then there was a letter from a beloved critic, Paul's mother. Dear Alice, she wrote, I wish to make a protest against the methods you are adopting in annoying the president. Surely the Congressional Union will not gain converts by such undignified actions. I hope we will call it off. But the pickets also received tokens of appreciation and support. Workmen who were digging ditches in the streets offered to make wooden supports for the pickets' banners. And Henry W. Blair, an 82-year-old ex-senator from New Hampshire, made his way down a picket line one day, leaning on his crutch and greeting each suffragette. We're going to stop there for this week. We will continue next week. I think we should be able to finish this before our meet on May 3rd. So let me know if you have any questions. Sorry we had to cancel for today, but we will be back again next Wednesday. Hope you all have a wonderful day.